Between 1911 and 1916, the world witnessed three tragic sea disasters. The first was in 1911 when a British warship, the HMS Hawke, collided with a civilian passenger ship, the RMS Olympic. Now the second you've probably already heard of, and that's the sinking of the famous Titanic in 1912. The third was another tragic sinking of a ship called the Britannic in 1916. These three sea accidents had something in common. Or more accurately, they had someone in common. This woman, Violet Jessop. She was on all three ships and she survived all three disasters. If you Google Violet Jessop, then you see she's often referred to as the Queen of Sinking Ships, because that's exactly what she was. She survived three of the worst sea accidents involving ships in the early 20th century. And so this nickname is definitely well earned. But how exactly did she manage to be on all three ships? And how did she survive each of these three sea disasters? Let's get into it, starting with the very first ship, the RMS Olympic in 1911. In 1908, at the age of 21, Violet Jessop left school to work as a stewardess on civilian passenger ships. At the time, the sea and ships were pretty much the only way humans could travel across the continent, and of course, over long distances. Now, planes had just been invented at the time, but commercial air travel was still decades away from even being a thing. So that left just ships and sea travel. And back in 1908, a number of companies had built huge shipping line businesses, which meant building large ships that could carry thousands of people traveling for long distances across the largest oceans in the world as a commercial business. Violet's first job was in this line of work. It was with a company called the Royal Mail Line, and she worked as a stewardess on the ship, so she was part of the crew. But by 1911, she had switched companies and joined White Star Line, which was one of the largest shipping lines in the world. Now, White Star Line had some big ambitions. The company aimed to stand out by offering passengers great service, great luxury on their ships, but most importantly, by building and operating the largest ships in the world. White Star Line had built the RMS Olympic in 1911, and it was the largest ocean liner in the world at the time, with a capacity of nearly 2,500 passengers. And Jessop was working as a stewardess on this ship, the RMS Olympic. The first sea accident of Violet Jessop's career at sea came on the 20th of September 1911. The RMS Olympic was heading on its fifth voyage and had left the British port city of Southampton, but it had not traveled far when it collided with the HMS Hawke, a British military warship that was specifically designed to sink ships by ramming into them. And it rammed into the RMS Olympic, but only by accident. This collision tore two large holes in the Olympic's hull, both above and below the waterline, which should have resulted in the sinking of the ship. But there was a small silver lining, because the Olympic had not traveled far from Southampton when the accident happened. And so despite the damage, and despite being very flooded, the ship was able to return to Southampton before it sank. Now, there were no recorded deaths in this accident, but things could have turned out very, very differently had the collision happened halfway across the ocean. And so ultimately, the Olympic was repaired after the damage and was back at sea only 2 months later. Violet survived that incident and continued to serve on the Olympic until April of 1912, when she was transferred to White Star Line's brand new ship. You might have heard of it. It was called the Titanic. After she was transferred from the RMS Olympic, Jessop was on Titanic's very first trip, the ill-fated journey from England to America, which started on the 10th of April in 1912. Now, if you've seen the Titanic movie, then you understand all of the fanfare around the ship at the time. The Titanic was the largest ship in the world, even larger than the Olympic, its sister ship. And the Titanic was also described as unsinkable, given its engineering design.
So this is the ship they say is unsinkable.
It is unsinkable. God himself cannot sink this ship.
And again, if you've seen the movie, then you also know what happened, of course, right? The Titanic hit an iceberg on the 14th of April and began getting flooded. When Titanic hit the iceberg, Violet Jessop was in bed, having completed a shift for that day working as a stewardess. But given her experience at sea, she quickly figured out that something was wrong, and she got out of bed and went onto the main deck. Within minutes, she was working with the ship's crew to get as many people as possible off the Titanic. But there was one problem: the Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats. Now, according to her memoirs, Violet was first ordered onto the deck to show passengers how to put on their life jackets and then how to get onto the lifeboats. But then as this was going on, she was also ordered to get on one of the lifeboats herself, presumably to help out the passengers that were going to be on that lifeboat. And then of course, as you know, about 2.5 hours after the Titanic hit the iceberg, it sank to the bottom of the Atlantic with only 706 people rescued into the lifeboats. And Violet Jessop was one of them. A few hours after the Titanic sank, Jessop and the Titanic's other passengers were rescued at sea and taken to New York, which was the Titanic's original destination. But then Violet went back to Southampton and went back to working for the White Star Line. At the time, she had already experienced 2 horrible sea accidents within 8 months of each other. But the next few years of her career were incident-free, at least until 1916. 6 months before the Titanic sank, White Star Line had begun construction of the Britannic, which was going to be even bigger than the Titanic. In fact, there were some rumors they were going to call this ship gigantic, but scrapped those plans after Titanic sank. Now, construction of the Britannic was completed in 1915, but the First World War had started at the time, and so commercial sea travel, especially across the Atlantic Ocean, definitely had to be paused. Instead, Navy ships were doing battle in the ocean, and of course, that's no place for commercial sea travel. The Navy had also begun to requisition passenger ocean liners to serve as Navy vessels in the war, and the Britannic, which had not even gone on its first voyage as a commercial passenger ship, was selected as a hospital ship for the Navy. Now, as of 1916, Violet Jessop was working as a stewardess for the British Red Cross and was assigned to the Britannic, which, as I said, was operating as a hospital ship for the Navy. Now, a big risk for any passenger ship that was requisitioned for the Navy during the war was that the chances of losing that ship during military service was incredibly high. To put this in perspective, more than 5,000 ships were sunk during the First World War. And on the 21st of November 1916, the Britannic became one of them, with Violet once again on board. On the morning of the 21st of November, the Britannic struck a sea mine that had been planted by enemy German submarines, causing a huge explosion that of course damaged the ship pretty badly. The damage was so bad that within 55 minutes of the explosion, the ship had sunk to the bottom of the Aegean Sea. But unlike the sinking of the Titanic, the evacuation of the Britannic actually saved more lives. White Star Line had learned from the tragedy of the Titanic where there weren't enough lifeboats. And so 35 lifeboats were launched off the Britannic compared to 20 that were launched off the Titanic. There were 1,066 people on board of the Britannic at the time of the explosion, and ultimately 1,036 of them survived. They were rescued from the water and from the lifeboats, and of course, Violet Jessop was one of them. Now, this meant that within the space of 5 short years, Violet Jessop had survived the ramming of the RMS Olympic in 1911, she survived the sinking of the RMS Titanic in 1912, and then also survived the sinking of the HMHS Britannic in 1916. The odds of being on these 3 ships and surviving all 3 accidents must have been super low. But whatever they were, Violet definitely beat those odds. Now, you might expect that people who experience tragedies of this scale and of this magnitude would basically throw in the towel and walk away from that line of work. Now, I can speak for myself and I can tell you for free that I definitely would never set foot on a ship again if that was me. And I managed to survive not 1, not 2, but 3 of the worst sea accidents of my lifetime. But not Violet Jessop. 4 years later, in 1920, she went back to work for the White Star Line before moving on to another company called the Red Star Line, and then later ending a career at the Royal Mail Line. And while working for the Red Star Line, Violet Jessop actually traveled around the world by sea, not once, but twice, between 1926 and 1934. But she finally retired from her career at sea in 1950 at the age of 63. And she enjoyed her retirement until she passed away at the age of 83 in 1971. And that's the story of Violet Jessop, the queen of sinking ships. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this and you want to go from hearing about sea travel to hearing about air travel, then definitely watch this video about how the official US Air Force One presidential plane was named. See you in the next one.